Usually when we talk about a map or like a blueprint, there's this underlying expectation of safety.
Right, some kind of structure.
Exactly. You look at a schematic for a house, and you can point to the lines and say, okay, there's the door. There's the foundation.
It's all built to keep you secure.
Yeah, to keep the elements out. It's supposed to offer some kind of logical shelter from the world.
It's designed as a refuge. I mean, and it's a very linear, logical progression from the ground up, specifically designed to make human habitation possible and comfortable.
But then you step into the sonic landscape of a conceptual album like the inventory, and suddenly that entire concept of a blueprint is just completely inverted.
Oh, totally.
We are looking at an architectural map, sure, but it's a map of emotional decay. It's a structure designed not to protect you, but to let the elements in.
To expose you to them, really.
Right. And today, for this deep dive, we are exploring the lyrical and, well, the sonic architecture of this incredible piece of work. It carries this rather haunting subtitle, Time is a Wolf That Eats Its Tail.
Such an amazing title.
It really is. And we've got a massive stack of material today for you. We've got the original lyric sheets, the producer's highly detailed studio notes, and of course, the tracks of the album itself.
Which are just dense. So dense.
Yeah, incredibly dense. So our mission today is to figure out how this album operates not just as a collection of songs, but as a meticulously constructed trap for the listener.
Which is, such an ambitious undertaking for an artist. You don't just casually listen to this on shuffle while doing the dishes.
No, definitely not background music.
Not at all. The studio notes reveal that the creators viewed the album as a controlled environment. They used very specific lyrical metaphors, violently contrasting production textures, and this massive overarching 5-part finale to physically force you through a psychological transition.
A transition from what to what exactly?
Well, you are meant to move from a feeling of intense, relatable personal isolation all the way down to the absolute freezing point of human emotion.
Wow.
Yeah, what the album's liner notes clinically refer to as absolute zero.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because if we want to understand how we eventually end up at absolute zero in that massive 5-part finale, we first need to look at the raw materials this album is built from.
The foundation.
Right. When I was going through the lyric sheets, I noticed that to chart this emotional decay, the album completely ignores your standard breakup tropes.
It goes somewhere else entirely.
Yeah, it relies heavily on 2 recurring elemental metaphors, which are mercury and iron. And I have to ask, why metals? If a songwriter wants to express sadness or like feeling stuck, why rely on the periodic table?
I think it comes down to permanence in biology. Yeah, what's fascinating here is how these metals perfectly set the stage for the album's central theme of being inescapably trapped.
Because they're heavy metals.
Exactly. Think about heavy metals in the human body. You can't just wish them away. You can't sweat them out easily. They sit in the blood. They accumulate in the tissue.
So it's a physical burden.
Precisely. The narrator isn't just sad. They are physically burdened by the toxic elements of their own history. Let's look at mercury first. In tracks like Mercury Dawn and Mercury and Lead, mercury represents this slow, toxic buildup.
The sensation of emotional numbing.
Right. Mercury is a liquid metal at room temperature. It flows, it coats things, but it's fundamentally poisonous.
Yeah, and in Mercury and Lead, the lyrics really lean into that physical sensation. The narrator says, my tongue is coated in mercury today, a silver film over every word I try to say.
That imagery is so evocative.
It is incredibly tactile. I read that, and I could almost feel that heavy metallic battery acid taste in my own mouth.
And the production reflects that heaviness perfectly, too. The producer's notes detail how they achieved that feeling of cold, fluid decay.
How did they do it?
They used a tempo of 65 beats per minute, which is roughly a resting human heart rate, so it's very processional and lethargic.
Right.
And they heavily applied a flange effect and a classic chorus to the guitars and vocals.
Okay, I saw those terms in the studio notes, flanging and classic chorus. But what do those actually do to the sound? Like, why do they make the listener feel like they are sinking?
Good question. To understand the feeling, you have to understand the mechanism. A chorus effect takes a single audio signal and doubles it, but it slightly detunes the copy and delays it by just a few milliseconds.
So it sounds like multiple people.
It mimics the sound of a choir, yeah. But because it's artificial, it sounds slightly alien and just overwhelming. Flanging is similar.
How does flanging work?
Historically, it was created by playing two identical tape recordings perfectly in sync. Then a producer would physically press their finger on the flange, the metal rim of one of the tape reels, to slow it down just a fraction.
Oh, that's wild. So it creates that sweeping sound.
Exactly, this sweeping, whooshing sound.
Uh-huh.
When you combine those two effects at a slow tempo, it literally sounds like you are listening to the music underwater.
It creates the auditory illusion of being a heavy element.
Yeah, as the lyrics say, just sinking down into the silt.
So if mercury is this numb, sinking fluid state, then iron operates as the complete opposite. It's the hard, inescapable cycle.
Right, the gravity.
And we see this in the track Iron Recurrence. Instead of sinking, iron represents the heavy mechanical gravity pulling the narrator back into old, destructive habits. The lyrics say, "The iron is in my blood." Back to the source again.
It's a relentless physical weight.
It really is. It's almost like a twisted form of emotional alchemy. Mercury is the slow poisoning and freezing of the mind, making you numb and fluid, while iron is the physical gravity.
The chains.
Yeah, the heavy chains dragging you backward into your worst habits.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, your alchemy analogy is spot on. I mean, in alchemy, the goal is usually to purify metals, right? To turn lead into gold.
Right.
But here, the alchemy is completely inverted. The narrator is taking their life experiences and distilling them into toxic, heavy burdens. The mercury numbs them to the pain, but the iron ensures they can never actually escape the cycle. It just pulls them back to the start.
Which brings up a really important transition. If the lyrics are painting this bleak picture of a narrator physically weighed down by iron and mercury, how does the music actually support that?
What do you mean?
Because, if I'm listening to a bright, bouncy pop arrangement, I'm not going to feel like I have literal iron in my veins.
Yeah.
The music itself has to build the trap.
Oh, absolutely. And it does by engineering a very specific, jarring contrast. The production shifts dramatically to mirror the descent of the narrator.
From the acoustic to the industrial.
Exactly. It starts by welcoming you into incredibly fragile, organic human spaces, and then violently throws you into cold, uncaring machinery.
The beginning of that shift is really evident in the inventory, part 1. The studio notes describe it as a dark, acoustic, goth folk arrangement. And listening to it, it is just incredibly intimate.
It really pulls you in.
They have this percussive acoustic guitar, a mournful, sustained cello, and these deeply vulnerable, breathy vocals talking about domestic stagnation. They are just cataloging the debris of a shared life.
It feels raw.
Very raw. You can almost hear the wood of the acoustic guitar breathing in the room, the squeak of the fingers on the strings.
And that creates empathy. Acoustic instruments require human touch. They're imperfect. They resonate with the physical room they are recorded in. But, that warmth is a setup.
A trap.
Yeah, because suddenly you are ripped out of that acoustic space and thrown into the industrial takeover. On tracks like Vein Signal or Ignition Fever, that breathing wood is entirely replaced by relentless 145 BPM motoric beats.
Yeah, the notes mention motoric beats as a key driver of that industrial sound. Is that just a stylistic way of saying the drums are playing really fast?
Not just fast, but relentlessly uniform. The motoric beat, which translates roughly to motor skill or engine-like, was pioneered by German experimental rock bands in the 1970s.
Right.
It's a driving 44 beat that almost never uses fills or cymbals to break the tension. It was originally designed to mimic the feeling of driving endlessly on the Autobahn.
So it literally sounds like an engine that cannot and will not stop.
Exactly. When you pair that with cold flanging and jagged, heavily distorted electric guitars, the dynamic goes from vulnerable to completely punishing.
I felt that punishment when listening, for sure. Going from that warm acoustic guitar straight into an industrial drum loop is incredibly jarring. It feels suffocating.
It's meant to.
But I have to push back here. From an artist's perspective, if the album suddenly becomes this aggressive, repetitive, uncaring machine, doesn't that risk alienating the listener?
In what way?
Well, why would someone want to listen to an album that feels like it's actively trying to trap and punish them alongside the narrator?
See, this raises an important question about the purpose of conceptual art. It's not always meant to be pleasant, Sometimes it's meant to be cathartic through shared endurance.
Shared endurance, I like that.
By forcing you out of the comfortable acoustic space and into the industrial machine, the album makes the narrator's lyrical trap a literal auditory reality for you. Take the track Ritual of Grease.
Oh, that one is intense.
Right. The lyrics explicitly say, tick. It clicks again. Talk. The circle completes itself. I am a machine of habit.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The vocals on that track are delivered with this deadpan cold detachment. The singer sounds like an automated public transit announcer reading a schedule.
Which is exactly the point. The repetition in the lyrics and that motoric drum beat are the sonic embodiment of the album's subtitle, Time is a Wolf That Eats Its Tail.
So the repetition is the trap.
Yes. The industrial drums aren't just an aesthetic choice to sound edgy, they are the gears of time grinding the narrator down. The album strips away the organic comfort to expose the cold, rhythmic machinery of a life stuck in a loop.
You're supposed to feel the exhaustion of the iron pulling you back to the source.
Exactly. It's demanding that you experience the exhaustion of cyclical trauma.
It is exhausting,
Yeah.
but in a way that keeps you completely glued to the narrative.
Yeah.
And all of this, the mechanical tension, those heavy metal metaphors of iron and mercury poisoning the blood, this overwhelming auditory concept of cyclic time, it all finally culminates in the album's grand finale.
The actual inventory suite.
Yes, the 5-part suite. It's a massive descent that charts the final journey from a lonely room straight into the freezing void.
It is a staggering piece of musical architecture, and we really need to take our time walking through how it breaks down the listener. We start with part 1.
Right.
As we mentioned, it brings back that slow 65 BPM tempo, that resting heart rate. The narrator is in this intensely personal isolation, literally cataloging the physical objects in a room.
The half-empty bottle of cheap mineral water.
Your old wool sweater in the bottom drawer. It's the anatomy of a departure.
The lyrics actually describe the silence of the room as a structural concern. I love that phrasing. It's as if the quiet itself has physical weight, like the absence of sound might literally crush the roof of the house.
That's the mercury at work. The heavy, slow accumulation of grief. But you can't hold your breath forever. The tension has to break, and it shatters entirely in part 2.
Shatters is the right word. The acoustic guitar is there for a second, sounding dissonant and spooky, and then the track just explodes into a frantic 160 BPM drum beat.
It's a shock to the system.
To put that in perspective, 160 BPM is the heart rate of someone sprinting or someone having a full-blown panic attack. The vocals shift from this vulnerable, breathy delivery into sheer, throat-tearing desperation.
It's pure panic.
The narrator describes staring at the dashboard lights in a parked car, and then suddenly they're driving, the engine screaming. They call it a frantic recurrence of every mistake, describing themselves as a glass jar hitting the pavement, splintering into 1,000 pieces.
The transition from the fragile isolation of part 1 to the intense internal storm of part 2 is the psychological breaking point of the album. The resolve is shattered.
There's no going back.
And here is the mechanical brilliance of that. Once everything spills out, once the vessel is broken, there is nothing left to protect the narrator from the elements. Which brings us directly to part 3 and part 4, which is the freezing.
This is where the atmosphere gets incredibly intense. Part 3 drops the tempo all the way down to a sluggish 55 BPM. We go from a panic attack straight into what feels like hypothermia.
The tempo is essentially cut to a third of what it was in part 2. The frantic energy is completely drained. The ledger is closed.
So where are we now, narratively?
The lyrical imagery moves to the freezing Montreal river silt. The narrator steps into the water, merging with the mineral, entering what they call the absolute zero.
Absolute zero.
And the instrumentation radically changes here to support that freezing. We hear mournful brass instruments, funeral bells, and these deep, bowed bass drones.
I really want to dig into those bass drones. Why do deep, sustained low frequencies and bowed basses make us feel physically cold or isolated?
It comes down to acoustics and how our brains process frequency. High frequencies vibrate quickly. They sound active, energetic, close by. Low frequencies vibrate slowly.
They move more air.
They physically move the air in large, sluggish waves. In nature, we often hear deep, sustained, low frequencies when we are submerged underwater or when we are separated from a sound source by a massive, thick structure.
Like being deep inside a cave.
Exactly. By utilizing those bowed bass drones, the producer is literally slowing down the listener's perception of time and tricking the brain into feeling submerged and isolated. The inventory is finished. There is nothing left to count.
Which leads us perfectly into part 4, the ultimate epilogue.
The quiet after the storm.
Yeah, the drums are completely on, no motor beats, no panic. It's a stark, minimalist solo acoustic track. The tempo just grits without a metronome. The vocals are barely a whisper, incredibly low energy.
The narrator is just walking on the fosse.
They say, "I did not bring a coat. I do not feel the chill." The storm in part 2 took everything, so there's nothing left to lose. They whisper, "The list is finally finished." It is the quietest, most desolate point of the entire album.
It feels like an ending. From a traditional narrative standpoint, it's a tragic, frozen ending, but it offers a sense of finality. The conflict is over.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Because it isn't over, just when you, the listener, think the album is finally letting you go, it flips the script entirely. Part 5. The coda.
The return.
Suddenly, out of that freezing silence, the track brings back the driving rhythmic DNA and the heavy martial snare drums from the very beginning of the album. The bass is overdriven again. The machine wakes up.
The iron wheel turns toward the origin. That's the lyric that drops when those snare drums hit. The march begins where the march ended.
It's terrifying.
All the sonic elements we heard in the first half of the album return for this grand, resonant realization, and the core thesis of the entire project is finally delivered. Time is a wolf that eats its tail. Time is a debt that ends in zero.
Such a heavy realization.
It's a profound, terrifying revelation that the quiet of Part 4 wasn't peace. It wasn't healing. It was just the bottom of the wheel right before it starts pulling you back up into the machinery.
So what does this all mean? I mean, when I was listening to it, the only way I could visualize it was like watching a star die.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, Part 1 is the lonely orbit, cataloging the empty space around you. Part 2 is the violent supernova explosion, all that frantic 160 BPM heat and splintering glass. Parts 3 and 4 are the freezing cold vacuum left behind when the light finally goes out.
And Part 5?
Part 5 is the black hole forming in the center. It's this massive gravitational well pulling everything, the light, the sound, the time itself, back into the origin to start the whole brutal process over again.
That is actually the perfect way to look at it. And if we consult the studio notes, the producer engineered Part 5 to behave exactly like a sonic black hole. Yeah, the Marshall snare drums and the reverse tape loops literally pull the sonic frequencies backward. It forces you to reevaluate every single track you just heard. Because emotional decay, as presented here, isn't a straight line where you hurt, you slowly heal, and you move on.
It's a circle.
It's a perfect circle. You process the grief, you hit absolute zero, and then the iron in your blood exerts that gravitational pull right back to the source. It's the liturgy of the perpetual restart, as they called it back in Ritual of Greece.
And as that realization sets in, Part 5 ultimately devolves into pure white noise. Just layered frequencies of static and rushing air getting louder and louder until it cuts to absolute silence.
It leaves you breathless.
It's an absolute masterclass in using musical structure to tell a psychological story. The inventory doesn't just tell you about being trapped, it builds the architectural trap around you.
Brick by brick.
It uses the toxic weight of iron and mercury, the violent clash of fragile acoustic guitars against cold, engine-like industrial machinery, and that exhausting 5-part descent to prove a really difficult point. Time doesn't always heal all wounds. Sometimes time just loops them.
And that is the true brilliance of deeply conceptual art. It doesn't just entertain, it demands self-reflection. It asks you to look at your own blueprints.
Absolutely.
I think anyone listening to this deep dive needs to consider their own inventories. Look at the structures of your life. Are the habits, the loops, and the cycles you are in actually moving you forward? Or are they just the iron pulling you back to the source?
Are you building a shelter or a trap?
Right. Are you building a shelter, or are you just blindly participating in your own liturgy of the perpetual restart?
It really makes you evaluate the machinery of your own life, the gears you might not even realize are turning. And there's one final thing I want to leave you with today, something for you to mull over the next time you look at the recurring habits in your own world.
What's that?
Well, as we noted, the album ends on Part 5 with that massive swell of sound dissolving into pure white noise, and then suddenly, absolute silence. If time truly is a wolf that eats its tail, and this album is designed as a perfect, inescapable circle, is that final white noise at the end of Part 5 really an ending? Or is it simply the sound of the tape rewinding in the dark, getting ready to play track 1 all over again?